on the red spot. So most stories are from the past. They're things that have already happened, and we like to tell them to one another because we enjoy them, and they stay with us over time. They help to define our sense of place in the world, and the very best stories shed meaning on our very existence. And so I was thinking a lot about that as I started to consider the idea that I was going to write my first children's story. But I realised when I thought about my own children's relationship to fiction that maybe things had changed a little bit. And it wasn't so much a concern about whether the stories would survive, but would we? And it made me think that perhaps I was very motivated to write about the future, to write sci-fi, because it enables you to ask those very tough questions, those big what-if questions, those big unknowns. What if, for example, the whole world, all of our environments, all of our communities, all of our climate, all of our fears spiral out of control? Where does that leave us? And what kind of potential is that for writing stories? When I first started writing SeaBEAN, I was working in an office in Greenwich, pretty much straddling the Greenwich Meridian, so I think that's why I was thinking quite a lot about time at the time. And I came across something called a SeaBEAN. And if you've never heard of a SeaBEAN before, it's something quite special. I've got one here, rather similar to the one in the slide. It's one of nature's brilliant inventions. It's a robust little vessel, waterproof, it can travel thousands of miles. It's actually a seed, or more specifically, a drift seed. And they grow on trees in the rainforest. And when the pod on the tree ripens and splits open, the seeds, the sea beans, fall into a watercourse and they flow out to sea, and they can travel thousands of miles. And many people hope to find one on a beach. And they do often wash up on British beaches because of the Gulf Stream washing them across the Atlantic Ocean. So this was something for me that got me thinking. And in my case, it germinated into something that was an idea for a story. And I started to think about other things that maybe would wash up in our lives from even further away than a SeaBEAN. Something like this meteorite, for instance, which has a potential to tell us things not just about our own planet, the future of our own planet, but tell us stories about the future of our universe. So I was thinking, okay, these are kind of key ingredients maybe that I was working with at the time to build up a sense of what my story was going to be. What if you take something that's kind of a cross between a SeaBEAN and a meteorite, a sort of time travel device maybe, and let them come barging into somebody's life, somebody's otherwise everyday existence? What sort of impetus would that be for a story? And you can tell already that this SeaBEAN device in my story was pretty much the main character. And what if that device, that SeaBEAN device, had strange kind of chimerical qualities, colour-changing abilities? It had encoded within it some secret information that could only be activated by a highly eventful process of trial and error. And that would be the key driver for my story. And then, of course, I had to think about, well, where on earth was this SeaBEAN going to wash up in my story? What kind of beach was it going to arrive on? Somewhere preferably very remote, very desolate, very wild. Somewhere perhaps like St Kilda, which is an archipelago. It's actually the remotest part of the UK, if you've ever wanted a little factoid like that. It's the remotest part of the UK. It's a World Heritage Site twice over, so it's quite a special place, which is what I was after. It's a real place, which was also something that I was wanting to write about, and it's an island, and we all love stories that are set on islands. And then because I was writing a children's adventure story, I needed one smart 11-year-old who was going to discover my SeaBEAN when it arrived on the beach one day on her island on St Kilda. The thing I need to tell you perhaps about St Kilda is that it's so wild and so remote and so desolate that the last people who actually lived there begged to leave in 1930. So Alice and the small community that have gone to live there in the very near future when my story's set, it's very near now, it's set in 2018, so in 2 years' time I'm going to have trouble explaining things. But I needed somebody like Alice who had a warm hands, a warm heart, and was capable of handling a little bit of weirdness, was curious enough to figure out why the SeaBEAN changes colour when she touches it, and how to get inside it, because of course there's no obvious ways in when it first arrives. And she would then obviously lead my story into the full sequence of SeaBEAN. So I was immersing myself in lots of information about St Kilda. I had accumulated quite a library by then. I was working with a map, not unlike this one, above my desk where I was writing. And the whole story got told. At that point, nobody knew I was writing fiction. I was doing it almost for my own amusement. But the book got finished in February 2009. And like most debut authors, I had absolutely no idea what to do next. So I stuck it in bulldog clips in a drawer, and it stayed there for 3 years until 2012, when I pulled it out again for some reason and reread it. And I realised then that the reason I hadn't known what to do with it was because the story was only 1/3 told. And that there were these 2 other amazing segments of the story that would make it into a trilogy. So I got quite excited at that point, and I thought, right, I need to quit my job. So I stopped working in Greenwich, and I started working in Surbiton from my desk at home. And I started to think quite a lot about the next story, the second instalment, because my story had barely gotten out of second gear. I needed to think about what the middle story was going to be. And of course, St Kilda has a very rich history. It goes back to Stone Age times. It's been lived on continuously until 1930. And there were a lot of rich things in the past that I thought would be fantastic in a time travel story, to have my characters travel back in time and not realise at first that that's what had happened, because at the end of SeaBEAN, the device is broken and they have to do a factory reset, and what they don't realise is it's kind of reset the clock a little bit too much. So Alice gets to meet all these characters from 100 years ago, and I got to imagine what would have happened, for example, if they turned up in a strange time travel device in 1918, in May 1918, when actually St Kilda came under attack by a real German submarine. Or what if Alice went even further back in time to the 1700s, when a certain Lady Grange was imprisoned on St Kilda against her will, in a stone clyde rather like this one? And what happens if Alice rescued her and brought her back to the present time? So at that point, I was fortunate enough to have been approached by a publisher who offered me a 3-book deal. She hadn't even seen sight or sound of the 3rd one yet, but I'd signed the contract, and I thought it was maybe about time I actually went to St Kilda myself, because there's only so much that you can find out on the internet. So I went off one epic day to see the magical place itself. It was a 12-hour journey, and it looks like quite a choppy sea. Apparently this was quite a calm day to go to St Kilda. And it was every bit as magical as I was hoping for. But also quite strange, because I think I'd gone there thinking I was doing a fact-checking mission, maybe take some promotional photographs and adjust a few things in my story if I hadn't got the distances quite right or whatever. But what I wasn't expecting was that it would feel like I was arriving into a very elaborate full-size film set that somebody had built for me from my imagination. It was quite extraordinary. So happy that St Kilda and SeaBEAN all kind of stacked up. We went to press with the book. We had a fantastic book launch at Foyles in Charing Cross Road, and my friend made this fabulous cake that has all the topography of St Kilda you could ever wish for, and a large SeaBEAN parked on the top there. And my story, Sea War, then was finished a few months later, and we launched that on a Route Master bus going around London and giving out copies of the book to various children's libraries around London. And then I came to write Sea Rise, and really that's what I want to sort of focus on a little bit more today, because writing Sea Rise, children often ask me when I go into schools, which one's your favourite? And I think Sea Rise was the most unexpected kind of experience for me, because at the end of Sea War, the children know far too much about this SeaBEAN, and whoever it is that's provided it has got a bit suspicious and has recalled it. And in the process of recalling it, the children somehow get abducted inside the SeaBEAN. It keeps them prisoner, and they find that they've been taken 100 years into the future to 2118. So what I had to do with my 3rd book was imagine what St Kilda would be like 100 years into the future, a rather inundated and ravaged version of it. And we're seeing a lot of signs even in the news today about what are going to be the effects of these disrupted weather patterns, these strange solar storms that are happening. We're starting to see the northern lights in much less northerly latitudes. And in Alice's case, she's struggling to come to terms with being on this island, wondering how they're ever going to get back to their present, and how it has come to be that some rather questionable characters have driven technology, including the SeaBEAN itself, she finds out, beyond its ethical limits. And that's when I realised that I'd got to the core of what made me want to write in the first place. It wasn't just to tell a really good story, although obviously that's a key part of it. It was to travel to a place in your imagination where you can no longer avoid the issue, where you feel compelled to do something to change what's happening in the world today. And that was what I hoped would be the take-home message of my trilogy. So when it came to designing the covers for the books, I realized that I needed to make them a little bit more arresting, a little bit more special. And this is the rather inadequate way that they are represented if you go and look on the internet. But what I wanted was something that had something of the quality of the SeaBEAN, that maybe when you interacted with it, it did something a bit different. So I said to my publisher, it would be really great, wouldn't it, if when we published the book, it changed colour. And I thought she'd just laugh and say, get out of here, you know. But I'd done some homework at that point, and I'd found a company in Cheshire that could print this special thermochromic ink onto the surface of the books. So they literally would do that. They would literally change colour. So here you can see my publisher's hand demonstrating it. I think we haven't got time for the audience participation, but you can all have a go later. So she went for it, and of course, what's not to like about that? You go into schools and children just want to handle your books. That you actually get a collective gasp when you do an assembly, and you have somebody with nice hot hands in the front row come and activate the covers of the book. But what I hadn't realised at that time was that I had this brilliant set of books with this brilliant sort of marketing gimmick to them, was that actually my books fell into this entirely new literary genre that I'd never heard about. It was a bit embarrassing because obviously I only found out about it a couple of weeks after the book came out. And I was in a bookshop in London, and I felt drawn to this table which had this sort of sign on it saying this word cli-fi that I'd never heard of before. And I thought, what on earth's that? I went over and had a look, and I thought, well, these books all have to do with climate change. And I realised that I hadn't written a piece of sci-fi at all. I'd written cli-fi, and my books belonged here on this table with these other ones. So I was a little bit sort of taken aback about this, and I thought, well, okay, it's just part and parcel of the whole process of writing stories from the future, you know, I'm going to have to roll with it. So I went home and I did some research, and I found out that the guy who'd coined the term is this guy here, Dan Bloom. He's American living in Taiwan, and he's very passionate and evangelical about it. And over the next few months, I came across a whole bunch of other authors who were writing both for children and adults in the genre of cli-fi. In fact, if you go on Goodreads now today, there's a whole page dedicated to cli-fi titles. And it was a weird sort of zeitgeist kind of a moment, really. Journalists were keen to interviewers. Hollywood were trying to jump on the cli-fi bandwagon. People were even going on climate change marches carrying cli-fi banners. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the editor of the children's book section of the Guardian newspaper asked me if I'd write a piece about why I write cli-fi. Now, I've written a lot of things over the last 20-odd years, both fiction and non-fiction, and I have to say this was one of the hardest assignments I've ever undertaken. And there were lots of toings and froings, you know, lots of drafts were handed back and forth between myself and the editor, and she'd say things like, oh, well, you know, I want to know more about your motivation as a writer, or I want to know more about you, or I want to know what you think about other children's literature. And although it was quite a frustrating process, I realised that it was also the most illuminating one. I got a lot of insights into what it meant to be a cli-fi author. I had to really think long and hard about it. And I realised that in going out and reading my books in libraries and bookshops and whatnot, I didn't just want to do that to sell more books, which is what a lot of authors seem to want to do. They want to reach their audience, don't they? I realised I needed to do something more than that. And at that point, I'd maybe gone and spoken in about 50 different schools around Kingston and across Surrey. I'd been on the radio a few times, and I'd even done a couple of literary festivals. But I realised I hadn't developed a sort of real sense of purpose about what I was doing in going out there and talking about my books. So I realised that the first thing I needed to do was to get the children out of the classroom. That would be a good start. Because I wanted them to feel a little bit like Alice does when they're transported to the Amazon rainforest and they find a golden nugget in SeaBEAN. And there's this moment where they find this amazing object, and it's something that's going to solve a lot of problems for them in the future. So they take it home with them, and it becomes a sort of talisman, and it enables them to unlock their story from the future. So I started to make these boxes that were like baby SeaBEANs, and you'd take them into classrooms, they'd have a few clues in them, a bit of treasure, and the children would use them as inspiration. It didn't really matter what was in the box in the end, because it was about getting them to focus with a sense of urgency and awe on a future moment. Here's a child writing a story set in 2114. It made the teachers quite nervous when I'd push away the desks and let them write on the floor and talk passionately and loudly about what would happen if their community was subsumed by water, or suddenly had a power down moment, or was invaded by displaced people from somewhere else. But it was that thinking outside of the box, even though I was giving them a box, that really mattered to me. It was taking climate change outside the science curriculum and into a sort of openly creative, participatory environment that cli-fi afforded me. And then I realised that it wasn't enough to give them the treasure and the clues. I needed to let them out to find their own clues and look for their own evidence. So we ran workshops on beaches with buckets and in fields with magnifying glasses. And it wasn't so much about them capturing samples from nature, specimens from nature. It was about capturing their imagination. I was trying to get them to look at those beaches and those fields in an entirely different way. And they'd bring the findings back to the classroom and they'd start talking about it. And if I'm honest, not everybody got out of the starting blocks. Some children found it just too daunting to be asked to write a story from the future. Others went off and quietly in 20 minutes came up with an absolutely heart-stopping story. The best workshops were where I realised that I'd even captured the teacher's imagination, enough for them to want to let the children carry on after I'd gone and do something that they could all be really proud of. Like these children who won a regional cli-fi writing competition that I ran, or the children at Hinchley Wood School, where I ran a writers' club over the course of a whole year, and they built up a collection of cli-fi stories that we published in an anthology. Or these children from Ride School in the Isle of Wight, who created sort of non-linear stories on these big black boxes that look a little bit like SeaBEANs as well, who were so proud of them they wanted to display them in the school entrance foyer afterwards. Or one child who even went home after my workshop and built the whole of St Kilda and SeaBEAN in Minecraft because they wanted to go on their own time travel adventures. But at the end, it doesn't really matter what the output is, what the physical output is. What really mattered to me was that in getting children to engage with stories from the future, their story from the future, to dream up their story from the future, that even if their own parents and the adults around them were still in some sort of weird denial about whether it was even happening in the first place, that when the time comes, when they are faced with climate change in their own lives and it's starting to really affect their own existence, it will be in their power to do something about it. Thank you very much.